Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Ecom.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
With the Westall incident, just tell us about what happened and why it's important to the world.
The Westall incident is an absolutely fascinating flying saucer incident. It's probably the largest mass witness daylight sighting of a flying saucer, certainly in Australia and probably in the world. On the 6th of April in 1966, in a place called Westall in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, Australia's second largest city, at around 10:15 in the morning, some students who were out on the playing field at Westall High School noticed, just out of the blue, this flying saucer type object appeared above them in the sky. And within several minutes, a huge number of the students at both Westall High School and the neighbouring primary school next door, Westall State School, witnessed this flying saucer-shaped object. Some people say there was one. Quite a few witnesses remember seeing more than one, two or three, flying low in the sky above the two Westall schools. And then the students watched as the flying saucer flew several hundred metres to the south of the school and disappeared behind a grove of pine trees. Because so many of the students saw the flying saucer going into the direction of this place called the Grange, and so many of the students knew the Grange so well because it was an area very close to their school, they did what they knew was very much against the school rules, jumped the school boundary fence, raced over the road and chased after the flying saucer. A small number of students were lucky enough to arrive in time to see the flying saucer still on the ground, or at least very close to the ground, and they watched it as it lifted up, tilted onto its side, and then flew off at an incredible speed.
Are any of those students alive today?
Nearly all of those students are still with us, still alive today. I've been in touch with almost 100 witnesses who remember seeing the flying saucer themselves, about 150 students who remember seeing the circles left behind in the grassy paddock where the flying saucer came down, and something like 60 students who were lucky enough to have seen both of those things.
In the history of this event, there was one individual quite prolific, which would be Andrew, the science teacher. Can you tell us a bit about his involvement and how it may have affected his life?
Sure. Well, Mr. Andrew Greenwood was one of the two science teachers at the school at the time. There was a male teacher and a female teacher. Andrew Greenwood was teaching science to a class at the time when the flying saucer appeared, and a student rushed into his class from outside, a girl who had been doing physical education at the time, yelling out, "There's a flying saucer outside, a flying saucer outside." After a few minutes, Andrew gathered his class together and went out to investigate himself. And sure enough, getting out onto the playing field, he saw the flying saucer for himself, as did the students who were in his science class. Andrew was very much affected by what he had seen. He could clearly see what it was that the students saw as well. And about a week or two later, there was a knock at his door at his home. And he opened the door to see two uniformed Royal Australian Air Force officers on his doorstep. He thought, okay, they're coming around to talk to me about what I'd seen, to take down more details about what I had seen. But in fact, they'd come around to do the very opposite. They came around to say, Andrew, there are no such things as flying saucers, and we don't want you talking again about what you say you saw. In fact, if you talk again to the media, at that point in time he had spoken to the local newspaper and his account and his photograph had appeared in the newspaper. If you talk again about what you have seen, we will make sure that you don't teach again in this state. They were coming around to threaten him, to put the hard word on him. Now, obviously, he was very shaken by this, and he remembers thinking at the time, if there are no such things as flying saucers, why are you two Air Force officers so keen for me to not say that I've seen one? Why are you two people so keen for me not to talk about what I have seen?
Historically, if you mentioned the term UFO, you might have been mocked or ridiculed. But by the year 2020, UFO sightings have been reported by tens of thousands of citizens and by dozens of high-ranking NASA, military, and other government officials. And while the scientific consensus might be that we will one day find intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, lots of evidence suggests that it has already found us. Surprisingly, the majority of UFO sightings have taken place under the Earth's atmosphere, closer to land than space.
Before the first atom bomb went off, we were using 5% of all the electricity in the United States. This is during the war, mind you, where electricity was at a premium because we were manufacturing guns, bullets, everything. 5% of all the electrical power in the United States was being used to separate uranium isotopes in secret for people to say you can't keep secrets.
Unidentified flying objects most famously made their media debut in the late 1940s, when atomic bombs were used for the first time. At that time, UFOs were known as flying saucers. And while some took the phenomenon seriously, the media and general public opinion sort of went both ways with it.
They explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
In 1952, Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10501 that legally allows any research, military or government agency to safeguard sensitive information from the public if that information may be seen as a threat of geopolitical or geoeconomic nature. But in the year 1960, NASA and the Brookings Institution commissioned a report titled The Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs. The report is most famous for a section titled The Implications of a Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life. This section examines the potential implications of such a discovery, most notably, the idea that such information should be withheld from the public. This was submitted to the House of Representatives in April of 1961. If something can disturb the peace or scare the public, it could easily be deemed worthy of a cover-up, under the guise of national security. This is why secret space theorists believe the US government has been so tight-lipped about UFOs and what we've really found in outer space. This full report is now part of the United States congressional record.
To our security, a challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
The term secret space refers to a conspiracy theory revolving around mysterious anomalies in outer space. Unidentified and scrutinized by civilians and space research agencies, These anomalies have been seen around the vicinity of our planet and throughout our solar system. These include outer space UFOs, unidentified lunar objects, and unidentified Martian objects. The term secret space also refers to a possible space research program that is not being disclosed to the public and mainstream media.
Are you working on anything top secret that we can't know about yet?
That's a good question. A lot of people think that, but no, everything, all these investigations and experiments we're working on that Peggy was talking about earlier, the scientists get all the data. We're not keeping anything from them or from anybody else. There was a day, where there were some somewhat secret missions back in the early days of the space program, but not anymore. We like to share our data so that everybody on Earth can benefit.
This secret research program is allegedly being conducted by space agencies and military black budget programs. The theory that such things are going on is as old as space travel itself.
Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. Ecom. Go. Surgeon. Go.
During the space race of the 1960s and 70s, the United States was racing to the finish line to become the most technologically advanced capitalist society by landing on the moon and sending probes to Mars. The US and the USSR were both launching impressive space exploration endeavors that led to some of the most amazing feats in human history. Landing a man on the moon, sending satellites to take the world's first close-up photographs of Mars. This was the ultimate statement of scientific and economic prosperity.
There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
But while this went on, strange things were reported by astronauts and cosmonauts caught in the middle of this race. In order to understand, one must start at the beginning of mankind's ventures into space.
Ignition, and we have a liftoff.
Space is being explored for the benefit of mankind.
In May of 1963, U.S. astronaut Gordon Cooper made 22 flights around the Earth on the Mercury 9 spacecraft. Flying over Australia, over the city of Perth, he reported that a greenish object with a red tail was approaching him along the way.
I think they were extraterrestrial pilots flying, no doubt about it. Well, that was, I was having some cameramen film the installation of a precision landing facility that we were putting in right on the edge of the dry lake. And this saucer flew right over them and put down 3 little gear and landed out on the dry lake bed. And they went out to, picked up their cameras and moved on out toward him filming. And he lifted off, put the gear back in the well, and climbed out at a very high rate of speed and disappeared. And so while I was going through all the regulation books and finding out the number to call in Washington to report it, I had them go over and develop the film. By the time they got back with the developed film, I was on the higher and higher and higher level officer talking to me. Finally, with the colonel telling me to, you know, when the film arrived at my desk, to put it in the carrier pouch. There would be a courier there at my office by that time already, and they'd arranged for him to fly in our base airplane back to Washington with these films.
June 3rd, 1965, Gemini 4 made its first manned flight, and pilot James McDivitt claimed he saw something very unusual. The Air Force claimed that what McDivitt saw was actually the Pegasus 2 satellite.
General McDivitt, have you ever seen a UFO?
Yes. During my flight on Gemini 4 in 1965, I saw an object in space fairly close to our spacecraft that I could not identify. It looked to me like maybe the upper stage of another rocket. I tried to take some pictures of it, but unfortunately, the pictures did not come out properly. Never were able to identify what it was, and all of our ground radar tracking data indicated that there shouldn't have been another object anywhere near us at the time.
Gemini 7 here, Houston, out of your 8. 1 clear, 7, go ahead. I'll tell you at 10 o'clock high. This is Houston. Say again, 7. We have a bogey at 10 o'clock high. Roger.
Chile Control here again. The reference to that conversation was bogey. It was Norman who was reported citing the bogey.
Also in 1965, the Zond 3 space probe was part of Russia's Mars 3MV project. This satellite took many photographs from the far side of the moon, looking back in Earth's direction. In frame 25, we see in the photo what appears to be a mysterious tower on the horizon of the lunar landscape. At the time this photo was taken, the camera was 10,000 kilometers from the surface of the moon. This allowed theorists to estimate the structure would stand at least 3.5 miles high. There have been reports that smaller structures can also be seen nearby. This tower has since been dubbed the Tower of Babel. NASA has never had an official explanation for this object, nor had the Russians. In the early 2000s, a whistleblower named Carl Wolf came out with a shocking story about something that happened to him in the late 60s. Wolf claimed to have worked for the United States Air Force as a photography technician.
We also did gun camera and reconnaissance film from C-130s, all sorts of aircraft that were going into combat situations. We processed the film for that. It was 1965. My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician, with a background in electronics. I'd been trained in electronic photographic repair. At any rate, I was in a color lab one day when my boss, Staff Sergeant Taylor, came over to me and said that they were having a problem with some equipment on the base, and it was the first lunar orbiter program, where they had a mission to pretty much locate the first landing sites for the 1969 lunar mission for the astronauts. So at any rate, he said they were having some problem with equipment over there. It was a similar equipment that we had. It was computerized contact printing equipment. And he wanted to know if I would go over and take a look at it. And he said to me, it's an NSA facility. And at the time, I didn't know what NSA was. I was pretty naive, and I thought he said NASA. So in my mind, for a long time, I thought it was a NASA facility that I'd gone to, but I remembered him saying NSA and converting it in my own mind to NASA.
And for viewers, the NSA is?
It's the National Security Agency.
How did you get to be in a position where you actually were to deal with the material we are about to discuss?
I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the lunar orbiter. And so I packed up some tools, I went over. So they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an Airman Second Class in there. I was an Airman Second Class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. I said, I need to do some troubleshooting on it. It had little printed circuit boards in it with discrete components at that time. It was before we had integrated circuits. So while I'm in there, I said to him, and I'm really fascinated with this process. How did they get the images from the lunar orbiter to the laboratory here? And he went through the whole process, describing how the various radio telescopes around the world were linked, and they telemetered the data into Langley Field. And At the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation and this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. I had no idea that there were other issues involved in this facility. So he starts telling me all of this information, and I knew that what we were doing was classified anyway, and that he could only share a certain level of what he was doing with me because of the compartmentalized nature of our jobs. At any rate, he told me how everything worked. He showed me the equipment where the digital information came in, where it was converted to photographic images. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon. And they would take and build up a photograph. They would scan one section of the moon, then another and another, and then they would get a larger image. So this mosaic then would be put in that contact printer, and that was then a print that was issued to whomever, the press, the scientist, whatever, wherever that was intended to go. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. I was fascinated by it, but I also knew that he was overstepping a boundary that he shouldn't be stepping over. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings. There were very tall towers and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. So it was rare that someone would do something like this, but this fellow and I were the same rank. I think he was very distressed. He had the same pallor and demeanor as the scientists outside the room. They were just as concerned as he was, and he needed to discuss it with somebody. So that was the end of it right there. I didn't take it any further than that. I just filed it away. But the interesting thing, every day that I went home, I would think to myself, I can't wait to hear about this on the news, And, so I'd turn on the TV and I'd look at the news to see if they're going to announce we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon, being really naive, And of course, here it is 30-some years later, and we still haven't heard about it.
Another now famous unidentified lunar object was spotted by the Lunar Orbiter 3 in February of 1967. A total of 149 medium-resolution and 477 high-resolution frames were returned from this mission. And in one composite image, an object known as the Shard can be seen. This object is supposedly located between the Bruce crater and the Sinus Midi Mare plain area of the moon. NASA has never acknowledged this anomaly, but LiveScience.com purports that the Shard image was doctored by popular secret space theorist Richard Hoagland. However, amateur astronomers have found the Shard themselves, suggesting it actually exists in the images. When looked at from another angle, a similar-sized shadow can be seen from the object.
So, where did I find the Shard? Well, I found it at the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter images on the LROC browser, and this is the area we're gonna focus on. It's not round, it's cubic, and here we see the shadow again.
The Apollo cover story was specifically designed to allow those missions to be conducted in the public eye, while at the same time actively concealing the fact that evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life had been discovered in space and on the moon. The scripting protocols followed during the Apollo program were for the most part highly effective at ensuring the astronauts did not divulge any sensitive information while they communicated over the public radio channel with Houston. However, when the astronauts were not in radio contact with mission control,
take on the Bravo, Joey. Roger. mentioning. Agree.
These comments were captured by a device mounted inside the Apollo CSM that was known as the Data Storage Equipment Recorder.
It's a very fantastic view to see the Terminator as you look along the edge of it. I think you'll agree that some of these craters that you're seeing in the picture now are really accentuated by the lengthening of the shadows as you approach the Terminator. They're very beautiful.
In addition to recording a variety of spacecraft parameters, the DSE's 14-track tape also recorded many internal crew conversations that took place when the astronauts were not communicating with mission control. Unfortunately, NASA claims that the original Apollo DSE black box tapes are missing and presumed lost or destroyed. The DSE recordings were transcribed, however, and although they were originally classified, those transcripts can today be found in the NASA archives. Listen as Jack Schmitt, the only astrogeologist to go to the moon, makes a less than cryptic joke to Houston regarding the boulders on the moon he has just been told to keep an eye out for.
We're almost to that rise. You ought to be in the vicinity of some very large boulders.
Houston, there's a lot of big boulders. Boink. I just saw a flash on the lunar surface.
Oh, yeah?
It was just right out there north of Grimaldi.
December 1968. Apollo 8 is the first human spaceflight to orbit the moon. Astronaut James Lowell observed the dark side, typically not visible from Earth. Some people think this is when Lowell saw something unusual, because he had this to say over the radio.
Hello, Apollo 8. Loud and clear.
Roger. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
Some people believe that the mention of Santa Claus was code for sightings of aliens or UFOs. A Canadian independent space researcher named Carrie Martinuke has assembled a high volume of credible secret space and UFO-related data from the Apollo era.
We're going to help uncover some of that today. I've been researching this subject matter for over a decade now, whether it's photographic or video evidence or transcript evidence.
Today I wanted to give you a closer look at a very brief segment of 16mm DAC motion picture footage from the NASA archives that was originally shot back in July of 1969 during the flight of Apollo 11. And the footage was taken through one of the windows of the Command Service Module during what was called the Translunar Coast, or TLC phase of the mission. And this was the 3-day period when the astronauts were crossing the almost 400,000 kilometer cislunar void that separates our Earth from the moon. And at some point during this outbound journey through cislunar space, one of the Apollo 11 astronauts did some unscheduled shooting with the 16mm DAC motion picture camera, and in the process managed to film several unidentified objects outside their spacecraft. And to show you what I mean, let's first just have a look at the raw segment of footage exactly as it's archived and shown by NASA in their Apollo archives. And I'll warn you, though, that this raw segment of footage is very brief and the scene it shows is very unstable. So don't blink or you might miss it. Here's the clip. While this particular clip has been digitally archived by NASA so that when played back it appears to be about 1 second in duration, it is not actually showing us a 1 second period of time caught on film. This clip we're examining here is actually time-compressed stop-motion footage. And in this case, the sequence is comprised of 11 individual distinct frames of 16mm film that were originally exposed at 1 frame per second intervals over a period of 11 seconds. And this type of stop-motion filming was possible because the Mauer 16mm DAC that was used throughout the Apollo program was in fact a variable frame rate motion picture camera that was capable of shooting at 4 different preset exposure speeds, either 1, 6, 12, or 24 frames per second. And in the case of this footage, Rather than archiving it at the correct 1 frame per second playback speed, they instead incorrectly archived the sequence as if it had been shot at 12 frames per second instead. So this means that NASA actually present this stop motion sequence in such a way that it is being shown at a playback rate that's 12 times faster than what the frames were actually exposed at. However, this segment of footage does provide us with a known stationary object within the field of view. One of the RCS quad thrusters on the lunar module is visible outside the window in all 11 frames of this sequence. So using that RCS quad thruster as our target object, we can stabilize this short sequence and effectively cancel out that camera shake. And in the now stabilized version of this scene, you see that the RCS quad thruster has been specifically targeted so that it now remains locked in place throughout the duration of the 11 frame sequence. And with the shake removed, you can now see more clearly that the several unidentified objects are moving around outside the window. Now, unfortunately, due to the stop motion 1 frame per second nature of this footage and the fact that the camera was handheld, there is significant object movement that occurs between each frame that was not caught on film. Whatever these objects are, they are clearly flying free in space, and we can say with certainty that they are definitely not any declared satellites or known debris. We don't know what they are, where they came from, how they got there, where they're going, or what they're doing there. And that, by definition, puts them into the category of being unidentified.
There's an enormous volume of data that the skeptics refuse to consider. Mr. Klass, for example, in 3 books, doesn't even mention the largest study ever done about flying saucers because the data in it clearly contradict the pronouncements that he makes.
I'll tell you what, make it easy on me again, Mr. Klass. The object that was moving at an apparent speed of 1,000 miles an hour
Ted,
versus...
I cannot identify it off the top of my head. All I can say is that in your 7-minute intro here, there were any number of those cases that have been explained. Several of the photos were hoaxes.
Okay, but before we run out of time here, what we're dealing with, and again, that's why the public, I think, gloms onto this as much as it does. Here we have a couple of pilots. I mean, these are experienced observers, especially about things like that. Doesn't that cause you to wonder just a little bit?
No, it doesn't, because the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek did an analysis of pilot reports in the Air Force files and found that in terms of misidentifying prosaic objects like stars and balloons, that pilots, military and airline pilots, were no better than ordinary civilians. Being a pilot does not improve your powers of perception.
When a debunker says no pictures can withstand careful investigation by competent investigators, we got to throw in the competence there. What it means is he hasn't looked at the evidence. There are pictures that have been validated by scientific groups. One of the best photo analysts is Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Got a PhD in physics. He's an optical physicist. Worked for a Navy research lab for 30 years. He has found several pictures that he has looked at very carefully with the best tools available to anybody studying optical phenomena and stuff, and found several that will withstand examination. To make proclamations about what's impossible from people who haven't studied the things in that field is pretty darn foolish.
The following conversations took place after CDR Stafford and LMP Cernan had separated Snoopy from Charlie Brown and were in the midst of conducting their landing dress rehearsal flight plan behind the lunar far side. Note that this DSE transcription covers both internal LM conversations between Stafford and Cernan, as well as their radio dialogue with CMP John Young, who was flying solo in the CSM Charlie Brown.
Houston, 2 minutes to LOS. Everybody here says Godspeed.
Okay, and we'll see you right on the other side in orbit.
Roger, 762255.
Just to be clear, the astronauts are discussing a noise they're suddenly hearing behind the far side of the moon. Note that the music is being heard in both spacecraft by all three astronauts at the same time.
Getting data. We don't have any voice communication yet. Hello, Apollo 10, Houston, over.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 10.
Noises reportedly were heard in May 1969 by the Apollo 10 astronauts as they circled the moon. The sounds, which lasted about an hour, were recorded and transmitted to Mission Control in Houston.
That is used to keep it sound down in Spacey, doesn't it? Do you hear that? That whistling sound?
Independent space researcher Kerry Martinuk, he would want you to know that a whole lot more of his evidence has been supposedly sanitized or doctored by NASA and the Department of Defense. A mountain of film and photographic materials from Apollo missions. Some of the greatest anomalies to have come out of early space missions would undoubtedly present themselves during the Apollo era.
Houston, Capcom, could you put the TV gal in the loop, please? Capcom, Goldstone, roger. Houston, Capcom, Goldstone, M&O, Net 1, go. The TV people do not have access to Net 1 in that area. Suggest we use Net 2 for that purpose. Okay, going to Net 2. Hello, Apollo 11, Houston. Please select Omni Bravo on board, over. Take on the Bravo, Charlie. Roger. Okay, Level, we have a picture. We see the Earth right in the center of the screen, over.
Hi, Roger. Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out. We can see the oceans with a definite blue cast. See white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth, and can see coastlines.
Apollo 11 astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, has actually given an interview where he confirmed that certain segments of his Apollo mission were indeed carefully scripted to control exactly what the public saw and heard. Back in 2003, Aldrin was interviewed for Neil Armstrong's only authorized biography, and during that interview, he was asked about whether some of the live television transmissions that were made from the CSM during the flight really were improvised and unscripted. And in response, Aldrin first admits that NASA, quote, went to great lengths, unquote, to make sure that they appeared unscripted. And he then goes on to say the following, and I'll quote Aldrin directly here. The fact is, they were carefully planned in advance. And for me, the exact words were written down on little cards stuck onto the panel in front of us. During the Apollo program, the moonwalking astronauts wore a small booklet that was attached to the wrist of their spacesuit, designed to serve as a quick reference timeline and scheduled lunar surface operations checklist. And here are the last 2 pages from Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad's actual flown EVA wrist cuff checklist that he wore during his 2 moonwalks. This pair of pages, obviously written before the mission and easily accessible to him while on the lunar surface, were clearly meant to provide Conrad with pre-scripted, already sanitized geologic or selenologic phrasing suggestions, reminding him to keep any descriptions he gives over the public radio loop censored so they focus on geologic aspects only. And there is no other reason for Conrad to have sanitized script notes describing his landing site in his checklist during these moonwalks.
We copy. Pretty good little jump.
So there's a foot on the moon, stepping down on the moon. If he's testing that first step, he must be stepping down on the moon at this point. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth.
Okay. I'm trying to cheat and look out there. I think I see my crater. Oh, baby. I'm not sure. Coming through 7. Okay, P64, Pete. P64. That's it, there's LPD. Roger, copy, P64. 1000 update. Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road. Outstanding, 42 degrees, Pete. Hey, it started right there. 42. Look out there. I can't believe it. Amazing.
During the November 1969 flight of Apollo 12, NASA's official historical record has always told us that Mission Commander Charles Pete Conrad and Lunar Module pilot Alan Bean touched down at their lunar landing site known as Stadio Cognitium, which is located on the eastern edge of Oceanus Procellarum, or the Ocean of Storms. And from NASA's official storyline, we are told that the pair of astronauts conducted 2 EVAs on the lunar surface during their 31.5-hour stay on the moon.
That may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
Today, we will examine some very relevant NASA archive evidence related to this flight, and I will demonstrate to you that NASA's official claim that only 2 EVAs took place during the Apollo 12 mission is a lie. Before going any further, I think it's important that we make sure that everyone appreciates the distinction between a moonwalk EVA and a stand-up EVA. So first, we'll take a quick look at exactly what the differences between those 2 extravehicular activity types are. It's important for us to remember here that the Grumman lunar modules used throughout the Apollo program did not utilize airlocks to allow the astronauts to conduct EVA operations. They instead had ingress-egress hatches, a pair of hatches on each lunar module, in fact. The hatch the astronauts used after landing on the moon in order to get from the interior crew cabin of the LEM down to the lunar surface so that they could conduct their moonwalks was a quadrangle hatch that was located on the forward, or what was in NASA speak known as the +Z side of the spacecraft. When the astronauts were inside the LEM on the lunar surface and wanted to conduct a moonwalk, they would first don their spacesuits and then put on and connect themselves to their PLIS backpacks, the Personal Life Support System backpacks, which contain the astronauts' primary and emergency O2 breathing supplies and CO2 scrubbers, water tanks to feed their liquid-cooled LCVG underwear they wore to prevent hyperthermic overheating, as well as the radio communications gear that allowed them to talk to each other and mission control in Houston when they were outside on the lunar surface. After donning the pressure suits and their PLIS packs, they would then put on their pressure helmets, LEVA helmet visor assemblies, and EV pressure gloves, and pressurize their spacesuits with O2 directly from the PLIS backpacks. And once that was done, they depressurized the crew cabin of the lunar module using a dump valve on the inside of the hatch to evacuate the roughly 4.6 psi internal atmospheric pressure inside the LEM until it equalized with the near vacuum external environmental conditions out on the lunar surface. They then cracked open the +Z hatch, and once that inward opening quadrangle hatch was ajar, the astronauts, one at a time, would then crouch down and back their way out of the spacecraft feet first, moving out onto the porch area of the LEM, still some 12 feet above the Lorraine, before finally descending the 9-rung ladder down to the lunar surface to actually start getting their feet dirty in the regolith. The second hatch on the LEM was the circular overhead docking hatch located on the top, or what was called the +X side of the spacecraft. And this hatch was the one which the command service module would dock with and remain attached to during the translunar injection, translunar coast phases of the mission, as well as during on-orbit operations above the moon prior to LEM separation and powered descent or after lunar rendezvous. And this +X topside overhead hatch was primarily used during the Apollo program for transferring crew and equipment between the LEM and the CSM when the 2 craft were docked in space. But when the LEM was down on the lunar surface after landing, this +X overhead hatch could be, and occasionally was, used for conducting stand-up extravehicular activities. One more simple but powerful influence that played a role in NASA's decision to conduct this covert SEVA during Apollo 12 dealt with maximizing the propaganda benefits. The Apollo 12 mission took place during the heart of the Cold War in 1969, remember, and we know that prior to the flight, NASA had very publicly billed that mission as being a demonstration of the LEM's precision site targeting and touchdown capabilities. So conducting this SEVA covertly would let NASA maximize the positive propaganda if the landing was found to be on target, while also giving them a head start to begin mitigating any negative media fallout if the covert SEVA had revealed that they touched down too far away from the Surveyor 3 lander to make the traverse over to it like they had planned to do.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first.
Thankfully for us, a few years ago, NASA actually slipped up and they got a little sloppy with their sanitizing and censorship protocols, resulting in the space agency accidentally publishing classified information within an unclassified public archive document, confirming the fact that astronauts Conrad and Bean did indeed conduct not 2, but 3 EVAs during the Apollo 12 mission. Back in September of 2006, an analysis was published in the NASA archives that was titled The Apollo Experience: Lessons Learned for Constellation Lunar Dust Management. And this document, as its title suggests, deals with examining lunar dust management issues that were experienced throughout the course of the 6 declared Apollo lunar landing missions, highlighting concerns that need to be recognized and evaluated in order to better aid in preparation for any potential future missions to the moon. On page 9 of this document, under the header of Surface Obscuration During Descent, Observations, we discover this rather interesting paragraph that slipped past the NASA censors. The blowing dust caused by the Apollo 12 LEM landing appears to have been worse than that of Apollo 11. In fact, a stand-up extravehicular activity was performed by the crew to assess the site prior to performing lunar surface EVAs because blowing dust completely obscured the view during landing. Now, if you have even a basic appreciation of the Apollo 12 mission's publicly declared lunar surface events timeline, you can look at this paragraph and see that something is very clearly amiss here, because, at least according to the official historical record that you've always been fed by NASA in the past, there was no stand-up EVA conducted during the Apollo 12 mission. Yet this NASA document, published a few short years ago in their public archives, directly references this event that occurred back in November of 1969, blatantly admitting that it did indeed happen. First off, it's important to establish that what you see here cannot be explained away as a simple misprint or an accidental typo of some kind. This document does not merely just acknowledge that a stand-up EVA did take place during the Apollo 12 mission, but in essence, it provides us triple confirmation of this fact, revealing not only that this SEVA did indeed occur, but also briefly declaring when they did it and why they had to do it. And the inclusion of those 3 key related points within this one paragraph rules out the possibility that what you're seeing here can be accounted for or explained away as being a simple erroneous misprint of some kind. When it came time to actually conduct their covert SEVA, Conrad and Bean used one of the hatch dump valves to evacuate the internal LEM atmospheric pressure, just as they would do as final prep for a moonwalk EVA. Commander Conrad then reached over his head and cracked open the overhead plus X hatch, swinging it inward on its hinges, where it was latched and locked in the full open position. And due to the dimensions of the plus X hatch, only one astronaut at a time could take in this impressive view of their landing site from the roof of the LEM. First, Commander Pete Conrad and then Lunar Module Pilot Alan Bean, one at a time, would step up and stand on the engine cover for the Ascent Propulsion System, the APS, that sticks up from the floor in the center of the LEM crew cabin, so it was much like standing on a bench or a low table. And this allowed them to gain enough height to poke their upper body out through the plus X overhead hatch and let them take in the full 360-degree panoramic vista from the roof of their spacecraft over 7 meters above the Lorraine. This excellent high ground viewpoint atop the LEM allowed Conrad and Bean to take in the lay of the land and have a good look around at the Statiocognitium site, getting their bearings and allowing them to identify their exact touchdown location. And of course, take plenty of photographs with the Hasselblad 70mm HTC camera as well. And those film magazines, because they were exposed during a covert, off-the-record SEVA, were never publicly declared or cataloged after the mission, so the public has been denied that Apollo 12 SEVA imagery, and it remains classified top secret to this day. Just prior to the covert SEVA commencing, the following exchange over the public radio loop took place between Capcom Jerry Carr and Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad, with Carr telling Conrad that they had apparently finally finished the platform alignment.
Intrepid Houston, the computer's yours. Roger. You have a new RLS and state vector. Thank you.
Immediately after Conrad says the words "thank you," this is followed by an extended and rather bizarre dead air period of 18 minutes and 45 seconds, where there is absolutely nothing heard from the 2 astronauts on the lunar surface over the public radio loop. You can confirm this in the official Apollo 12 mission audio file in the NASA archives, a waveform analysis of which we're looking at right now. The area you see highlighted in blue here is covering the full dead air period. This is where Conrad and Bean were actually conducting the covert stand-up EVA. And just to clarify, The waveform spikes that you see occurring within this time frame, highlighted in yellow here, are not due to communications from the lunar surface. Those waveforms are denoting radio voice traffic between Mission Control and the third astronaut, Command Module pilot Dick Gordon, who you will remember was actually on orbit above the moon in the Command Service Module, call sign Yankee Clipper, while Conrad and Bean were down on the lunar surface.
Yankee Clipper, Houston, the CMC is yours.
Thank you. How are things going on the surface?
They're doing great, Dick.
The area highlighted in blue here is showing the full segment of dead air along the mission timeline, and you can see that during that segment of time, the astronauts were officially supposed to be describing and photographing the lunar surface over the public radio loop. All the public got to hear during that period was dead air, though. The fact is, Conrad and Bean were describing Statiocognitium and were taking photographs during this public blackout period, but they were doing it secretly over the private radio loop while conducting their covert SCVA. For any Apollo crew to be able to covertly conduct this type of off-the-record operation during a mission without the public knowing about it would have to mean that NASA must have possessed some kind of technical capability that allowed Mission Control to carry out secret radio communications with the astronauts when they were in space or on the lunar surface. Unfortunately, many people still seem to be under the erroneous impression that the NASA archives offer the public a 100% complete and unedited record of all radio traffic between the astronauts and Mission Control during the Apollo program. And people think that because NASA over the decades has led you to believe that their lunar explorations had nothing to hide from the public and were entirely transparent, uncensored affairs. And that is simply not true. Just to quickly prove to you right now that this covert comms capability did exist and was employed during the Apollo program, we can take a quick look at a couple brief quotes from Apollo astronaut Eugene Cernan that he published in his autobiography, The Last Man on the Moon, where he blatantly admits to the existence and use of the private radio loop that let him secretly talk with Mission Control at least twice during his Apollo 17 mission to Taurus Littrow. Stripped down to our liquid-cooled underwear, we had a quick dinner, debriefed with the guys on Earth via a private radio loop, and played with some of the rocks we had stowed in the cabin boxes. In this next quote, Cernan describes another brief conversation over the radio that he had following the end of the second lunar surface EVA, and the conversation Cernan is referencing here was between himself and NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations back at Mission Control, a man by the name of Deke Slayton. And Cernan was concerned here about the fact that prior to their flight, the Palestinian terrorist group Black September had actually made several threats towards the Apollo 17 mission and the astronauts' families. And with the recent Munich massacre at the 1972 Olympic Summer Games just a few months prior, no doubt still in the back of his mind, Cernan wanted to make sure that his family was safe while he was on the moon. And here is how Cernan described this brief off-the-record radio conversation that he had with Deke Slayton. After we had some chow and settled down, Deke told me on a private radio loop that everything was fine at home. I talked to Barbara, and she said everything is okay, he said. Not a peep from Black September. An examination of the Apollo 17 lunar surface mission tapes and voice transcripts in the NASA Public Archives clearly demonstrates that these private radio conversations that Cernan describes in his autobiography were never officially recorded or transcribed onto the public record of the Apollo 17 mission. So we can state with certainty that these secret voice transmissions did happen and were deliberately censored by NASA and sanitized from the official public record entirely. The only reason we know that these conversations in fact did take place is because astronaut Gene Cernan openly admitted to it, confirming both the existence and use of this private radio loop during the Apollo program. We know that this stand-up EVA had not been a part of the publicized pre-mission flight plan, so the fact was it was simply not a part of the Apollo 12 public script. And make no mistake, the Apollo missions were heavily scripted, highly censored affairs. What the public has been told about those amazing missions to the moon was merely a sanitized, censored version of what was really going on, what was really being said, and what was really being seen and filmed up there.
Man, you talk about a mysterious-looking place. They can cut some parts of those pictures out and make a nice photograph.
So there were indeed sanitizing methods or pre-planned scripting that was going on during the Apollo program to help control exactly what the public saw and heard. And this kind of censorship during those lunar missions happened a lot more than most people are aware. We're just scratching the surface of that subject here.
This could all be an effort to keep the public from seeing more about what is really going on in space. one question has lingered in our consciousness for decades now. Why haven't we been to the moon since 1972?
First of all, why do you think it didn't happen?
Well, there's overwhelming proof that it didn't happen. There's people researching this topic.
On July 20th, 1969, one of the most momentous events in human history occurred. People walked on the moon. Eventually, the United States completed 6 moon landings, and then we suddenly stopped.
If men really did walk on the moon in the 1960s and 70s, we'd have been back by now. Therefore, we've never been to the moon. Well, no.
So human spaceflight programs since Apollo have made up the majority of the NASA budget, and the majority of those programs are performed by aerospace contractors.
This is Lori Garver. She was the deputy administrator for NASA under President Obama. Lori says those contracts have been so long-lived that they've locked NASA into certain technologies, mindsets, and dollars.
No one wanted to compete, and competition is where you drive down costs.
The official explanation for our long absence from the moon is apparently very simple. Going to the moon is expensive. And more evidence is mounting that private companies such as SpaceX may be the first to return us to the moon, and furthermore, land a manned mission on Mars. But secret space theory purports that there's something else making matters more complicated. Some believe we have been warned away from the moon by extraterrestrials. Some believe we are still going to the moon, and the public isn't being told about it.
Did legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, who directed such masterpieces as The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Dr. Strangelove, help perpetrate an Apollo 11 moon landing hoax for NASA?
Some people believe that undisclosed advanced technologies such as anti-gravity are being employed to carry out some of these secret space endeavors.
So does the science support that aliens could travel here?
The studies on interstellar travel, and I know something about them because I worked on those studies. The science and technology that we know a great deal about tells us that if you play your cards right, you can go to the stars. It's going to cost a tremendous amount of money. I'm not saying this is easy. Look, if I told you about an aircraft carrier that could operate for 18 years without refueling, you'd say, you're crazy, man. If I told you that 50 years ago. But it's real. But I'm saying with what we know, even though we haven't done it yet, technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. This camera, if you told somebody you could do what this thing does 70 years ago, he laughed his head off. So we have examples in our own life, which today's generation doesn't know what we did before. You know, gigabytes? Come on, what are you talking about?
And while there are varying degrees to the validity of some of these theories, the fact is there have been unexplained anomalies throughout our history of space travel.
Top astronomer in the United States said if there was one thing he was sure of, man would never fly any distance in a vehicle. This was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. Top English astronomer, Astronomer Royal, in 1956, an interview in Time magazine, mind you, said space travel is utter bilge. Nobody would pay for it. What good would it do? What we need is better tools for astronomy. Sputnik went up the next year. The field that has benefited the most from space, scientific field, is astronomy, because you can get above the atmosphere and it's a lot easier to see things and so forth and so on. But the rules for debunkers: first, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. 2, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. 3, if you can't attack the data, attack the people.
The mayor has investigated, has found that Ed and his wife went back to City Hall and... What?
Go ahead, let him finish, let him finish.
It's the mayor's word against you, and you have 2 convicted felonies on your record. You served time, once for forgery once for car theft. So I choose to believe Mayor Ed Gray III.
What do you say? Okay, you have.
When I was an 18-year-old boy, I did get in trouble with the law. But what that has to do with UFOs, only Phil Klass knows. Now, this type of ridicule is the same thing that the government does to virtually every high-profile UFO case.
It's easier. Those are the primary rules. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. That's a crucial aspect.
Let's get the people in authority to say what they're doing with our tax dollars and what they're finding out.
Okay, Phil, you say what?
Well, Oprah, I have never read a book labeled nonfiction that is riddled with so many errors of fact. You know, there are all kinds of errors of fact. He claims to have visited Cheyenne Mountain, and yet he claims that there is an elevator that goes down 2,500 feet. There is no such elevator. He claims to have visited the former Project Blue Book office at Dayton, Ohio. There is today no such office. His book is just riddled with errors of fact that could be checked.
Okay, you say what, Howard?
It's part of Mr. Klass's distraction technique. I mean, the real issue is whether or not he's fat or thin. I'm talking about when he was thin or thinner. Was about 15 years ago when I make that reference in my book.
About 40 years ago.
I make that reference in my book. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is basically not whether or not elevators go up or down. The real issue is what is the government doing? What is the government spending with money? If one wants to quibble about facts, Mr. Klass has made a career of this. I mean, having him review my book sort of is having like an Iranian minister of culture review Salman Rushdie's book.
Oh, come on.
I mean, your mind is made up, and you can pursue all this.
Now, I'm a nuclear physicist. I want the facts. That's what I want, is evidence. And I also say sometimes you have to keep a gray basket, I call it. Not black, not white, maybe. People want a yes or no answer to everything. Well, sometimes you have to say, I don't have enough data. Who knows? Things are complicated. UFOs aren't simple things. I mean, ask me about Roswell. Well, I've been working on Roswell since 1978. That's a long time. You know? And I've heard a lot of stupid anti-Roswell arguments, but that's beside the point. But almost entirely from people who don't do their homework. And as a matter of fact, a key point in many of my lectures is that I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. And after each one, I ask how many people have read this. I'm lucky if it's 2% have read any of them.
Well, what was recovered was a radar target, balloon borne.
That is the cover story that was put out. We know it was a cover story based on the testimony of the people who put out the cover story. General Thomas Dubose was the Chief of Staff of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth Army Airfield, General Ramey's Chief of Staff. General Dubose told us that the balloon story that Phil insists upon talking about was a cover story put out by the government simply to get the reporters off their back.
Philip, are you a debunker of all UFO stories? Well, is that your purpose? I look for explanations.
Philip J. Klass spent all of his press appearances attempting to debunk the credibility of UFOs and the evidence discussed over the years of ET visitation.
Typical of the debunkers. You know, why don't they ever land? Well, they land all the time. Ted Phillips in Missouri has looked at thousands of physical trace cases from 80 countries. I mean, you know, these cases are all over the place. But when a debunker says, why don't they land, it means he hasn't studied that data.
Recently, the Department of Defense disclosed that they once ran a $22 million research program that tried to figure out the nature of these objects that were buzzing around our planet. This program was called AATIP, or Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Today, the US government has alluded to funding a new research program, only this time, instead of referring to the phenomena as UFOs, the new term is UAP, or Unidentified Aerial Phenomena.
I have taken on debunkers, and it's a sad story when you realize that they haven't done their homework, they've been very selective, it's propaganda. You know, propagandists have been around a long time.
Well, if they are extraterrestrials, why hide it?
Yeah, right. That's what I say. Why hide it? Look, this would be the greatest discovery in the history of science. NASA would be elated. Of course, they go to Congress to get more funding. Why would anybody cover this up? And look what happens when they make even the smallest discoveries. Of course, we hear all about it.
James? I have a question to ask you.
Yes.
If UFOs, and I'm speaking hypothetically for a moment here, if UFOs are real, it would be one of the greatest discoveries of our time. Do you agree with that?
Of course.
Now, if UFOs, when I use the word if, were buzzing around in our airspace, who would be best equipped to know about it?
Well, our government, perhaps.
Military?
Maybe.
So we've got the highest-ranking military officials in the world telling us right now that these things are real. We've got generals, we've got admirals, we've got colonels, we've got presidents, governors. If we can't believe them, who can we believe?
A lack of evidence.
I'm sorry, if we can't believe them, who can we believe?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily.
radar
there is no.
sightings.
Listen, guys, wait.
Evidence. You don't talk about evidence.
This is simply a lack of evidence. So when I say, where's the spacecraft? You say, they hid it. Where's the documentation? They covered it up. This is like the weapons of mass destruction thing. Where's the evidence? The fact that we can't find any means that they're there because...
As we continue into modern space exploration, NASA became more sophisticated in their approach at hiding what they were recording above and beyond.
Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under occurrence. We have an unidentified flying object